gets the nation's all. A million mothers, yes, and there'll be billions more. And while within each mother heart they pray.
Welcome again to another adventure with books and Gloucester Bookies. However, this is a special production, unusual, the only one like it, I think, that we'll have in this format, in which I am joined by Ray Hildenen, who will be asking me questions, and we'll be developing one theme. As you saw, I think, in the opening, Abraham Lincoln's mother. And technically, actually, Abraham Lincoln's mother and another relative, soon to be named, announced. And I'll go from there. Raymond.
Well, Wayne, thank you so much for presenting this to, first of all, to me, but also to our audience. And I want to remind some of you that you may have seen Wayne doing an earlier presentation of this at the Sawyer Free Library. It was very well received, and it's really a wonderful topic that Wayne has developed here. There is very little known about Lincoln's forebears, and so Wayne has really done some wonderful research, and I'll lead that into my first question. I understand you did do quite a bit of research both on Abraham Lincoln and his parents. Isn't that correct?
Well, it's a good question, because back even in my high school days, I was interested in, many of us are, interested in that man whose picture is on the Lincoln penny. Abraham Lincoln, he's up in Mount Rushmore, and what more? We want to know more about him. I think all of us want to know more about him as we go through high school and beyond, and have our lives recognizing the presidents. And gee, was there a presidential model that might be followed, or something like that? I don't want to confuse anybody. However, these many books in front of me mostly are about Abraham Lincoln. And if you did percentages, each instance, I think, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, his mother, and as we'll find out, important in history, her father, are really only far less than 1% of any of these books. So anybody who thinks I'm going to be doing a reading for an hour in which I go from book to book is incorrect.
Oh.
I didn't do that in life. I'm not going to do that in this program. It's just going to be those items, juicy tidbits that we can find out about Abraham Lincoln's mother, I'm going to be able to quote and talk about with you.
Okay, so to start us off then, it really involves a lot of research. And a lot of research that actually hasn't been even done. So you are paving some new highways here. So how did you seek out information about Lincoln and his family?
It came to me in this way. I took a class. It really was a summertime class for a week, I think it was, maybe 10 days, with a wonderful instructor, Professor Charles B. Strozier.
Yes.
And now this book of Charles B. Strozier's was in about 1989, 1990, on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. It was well reviewed. It was a bestseller. Lincoln's Quest for Union. He was the first, what you might call, psychobiographer of Lincoln. And in his book, it was a wonderful book anyway to read. I found this. I'm going to read to the audience and to you, Ray. When Lincoln found that his mother had not been born, quote, legitimately, unquote, if she'd been born outside of marriage, this is what Charles B. Strozier concluded from some good evidence. Rather than shame, Lincoln felt a secret pride in his clouded past. The father, his grandfather, his mother's father, the distant and mysterious Virginia planter, thus gave Lincoln a genetic explanation for the profound differences between him and his crude, illiterate low-born family. Now, you understand, he's growing up in a cabin in the woods, far from a lot of other people, and he's seeing his family and even others around are rather coarse people without without education and probably without all their teeth. So he's having a time mentally. All kids struggle with this identity, and he's saying, "Geez, I'm smarter than these people. I have really a different kind of a mind or brain, and even ambition." To be more than a farmer. And he had to decide why that might be. And the cause and effect worked on him. What his mother had told him about his grandfather, which is that he was a rich, prominent, important man from the time of the Revolution, a contemporary at least, if not a colleague, of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson back in Virginia. It went to his head favorably. He didn't share that with a lot of people. He kept it in his head and his heart securely, probably his deepest secret, but one of the most important motivators in his life. I don't know what your question was. We'll go for it.
Well, I think that was sort of a lead-in into. I understand you have a very sort of anecdote about a joke that Lincoln told his mother. Is that correct?
I love the way joke in sort of a joke in quotations, because it isn't the kind of joke that we would these days appreciate so easily or grasp. I might have to read it more than once to be fair, but it is important, and I felt that this is twofold unique in the study. Anybody who was going to study Lincoln at all, to a little degree or to a lot, to read a biography or not, is going to say, I wonder if anybody preserved a vignette, a little interaction between Abraham Lincoln and his mother at all. Speaking together, what one said and the other said back. A little, like you have on the, what do they call those, video clips or something, or little YouTube kind of 1-minute things. And somebody did save it. Of course, it's in print. It's not photographed. It's not a video. It's the only, I swear to that, and I've looked, it's the only recorded, reported, preserved interaction between Abraham Lincoln and his mother.
So
and
what was
it
it exactly?
Telling a joke, telling a comical thing. But on what topic? You'll be, I think, somewhat astounded. This was preserved by a cousin of his, an older cousin named Dennis Hanks. Dennis Hanks was living in the same cabin with the Lincolns, had been taken in because his own parents had died. So he's 10 years older than Abraham Lincoln, and he's in the cabin, and he's overhearing or observing the interaction between his young cousin Abraham, 8 or 9 years old, because Abraham's mother died before he was 10.
Yep.
So this has to be when Abraham is 8 or 9 years old. Dennis Hanks wrote a letter that he told about this. Again, I'm going to have to read it twice because you won't recognize it as a joke. You won't recognize it. One day, when Lincoln's mother was weaving in a little shed, she had her own weaving area, weaving room or shed outside of the cabin, Abe came in and quizzically asked his good mother, who was the father of Zebedee's children? That's the joke. She saw the drift and laughed, saying, get out of here, you nasty little pup, you. He saw he had got his mother and ran off laughing. Now, I'm going to say it again, and maybe before I do, I'll say Zebedee is in the Bible. Zebedee is a name in the Bible. Zebedee was the only one in the New Testament who's referred to essentially exclusively as a father. Zebedee is the father of two disciples, I think it's James and John. And when they were called to follow Jesus, this is written up in the Bible, and Lincoln was a close reader of the Bible, and his mother read the Bible to him.
Yes, he was.
Said
And they were.
Dennis Hanks, and many of them in those days read the Bible very closely. Zebedee, notoriously, did not object or speak or encourage, he was indifferent, to the departure of his sons from him, the separation. And it was ultimately a permanent separation. They didn't exactly run away from home, but in his presence they vanished following Jesus. And here he is sitting back in his property, which was boats. He was a owner of a fishing, sounds Gloucester rich.
Yes.
He was the owner of a fishing boat or two, and he had hired men, otherwise known as servants, whom he kept busy. If they weren't fishing out on the lake, this was actually freshwater fishing, if they weren't fishing, he was having them do other tasks, such as mend nets. And that's all in the Bible. So if anybody's saying Zebedee to his mother's going to recognize Abraham, is talking about somebody whom she's familiar with. She has encouraged him to imagine, to perceive vividly in front of him, and she talked in that way. Yeah.
And who is this mystery man in the background?
Now, Zebedee obviously is a representative, not the actual one in the Bible. He's a convenient name. Mm-hmm. He's the prototype for father. He's a father figure, a simple, generic father figure. Then you will say, wonder what father he was talking about when he was talking about to his mother. Here we go again. Same joke, see if you get it. One day, when Lincoln's mother was weaving in a little shed, Abe came in, he's 8 or 9 years old, very precocious, and quizzically asked his good mother, who was the father of Zebedee's children? She saw the drift and laughed, saying, get out of here, you nasty little pup, you. He saw he had got his mother and ran off laughing. Usually, if you say, let's say John Smith's children, you know who the father of those children is. It's John Smith's children. So the joke, or intended joke, when you say who was the father of Zebedee's children, is that, whoa, you've got to laugh if it's not Zebedee.
Who is it?
If it's not Zebedee's children. But, well, in the Bible, this same father figure is notoriously a non-father. He lets them go. He's indifferent to them. He doesn't pay attention. He's rich. He's paying attention to his boat, his servants, his fishing industry. He's not paying attention to his kids. So again, he's that type. Well, is there an example in his mother's life, Nancy Hanks' life, where it would hit close, it would be personal, it would be an inside joke to talk about a father who was not a father who abandoned her, who stuck with his property, who was rich, who had servants being one of those euphemisms for slaves or enslaved people. Yes. And when he says, who was the father, as soon as you start those words only, who was the father, that was a story of her life.
Yeah.
Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was born into marriage. He was, I think, the third son of a married couple. No illegitimacy at all. On the other hand, Nancy Hanks, her mother being Lucy Hanks, she used her mother's name. Mm-hmm. Who was the father? Was just the question. Something she had to deal with her in her own youth or childhood. You remember I read from Charles Strozer's book, and I said Lincoln had had to pause and ponder about an explanation for her differences between him and these coarse, crude people around him. Well, his mother, likewise, in her youth, way back, as Nancy Hanks, growing up, had to think, why am I so bright and brilliant and smart and imaginative, and everybody around me is like not? And it must be my father. So this ideal father, Virginia planter, rich man, plantation owner, a planter you might say, plantation owner. They often use the phrase in Lincoln biographies, Virginia planter. It means the person who owns a plantation. She developed an amazingly positive view of her father. Although the father caused her misery, disappeared, never supported her. And Abraham, her son, at 8 or 9, was pushing back on the idea that grandfather was so great. He was more of a Zebedee mom, wasn't he? He was one of these that you'd have to say, who is the father of this guy's kids? Because he didn't take care of you, didn't stay by you and grandma and so forth. So that's a little bit more.
Yeah, and our let me say here too that our audience at the Sawyer Free Library, at this hint of illegitimacy, or it's more than a hint, you had them in the palm of your hand at that point. People were really interested in this, and I think it's testimony to your ability, Wayne, to take a little nugget of a story and turn it into the gold nugget of a story. So let me ask you, what do you think she inherited from her father?
Well, both ways.
Or am I jumping the gun here?
No, it's a perfect question because it's both ways. What she inherited, and then she endeavored to convey to her son to make him feel that he inherited. I'm going to quote now from Abraham Lincoln's law partner. Abraham Lincoln's law partner actually wrote a biography that is in many libraries, known colloquially.
Is this Herndon?
Yeah. Billy Herndon was his law partner. Billy Herndon wrote what is popularly known as Herndon's Lincoln, and it was issued, 20 years after the Civil War. Lincoln had been assassinated, long dead, but Herndon researched all over that he could and came up with a book biography that was published, I think it was in 1889. The first edition was 3,000 copies. Those 3,000 copies had what I'm going to read to you, this section at the very beginning, the first page or two, and it talks about illegitimacy. But those 3,000 copies, first edition, Herndon's Lincoln, were criticized for being indiscreet, shouldn't defame the president, talk about his illegitimate mother, and bring that out. And the second edition, and everything for like 50 years, eliminated that. This was censored.
Yeah.
You can find Herndon's Lincoln books, 1900, 1910, doesn't have this in it. And then more recently, editors have gathered and put back together Humpty Dumpty. They put in this, from the original 3,000 copies, this section that I'm going to read from you. And as you said, audiences then were and now are fascinated. Lincoln, this is his law partner. Lincoln confidentially told him, among other things, that his mother was the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks and a well-bred Virginia farmer or planter. And he argued that from this last source, his grandfather, came his power of analysis, his logic, his mental activity, his ambition, and all the qualities that distinguished him from the other members and descendants of the Hanks family. The extreme degree to which he felt he had inherited something good, that he should make something out of, led him, I believe, and now it's time for me to announce, I suppose. I've researched and written and published a book about Abraham Lincoln, American Prince. The reason being, I do believe American Prince is what when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a poor but honest boy. He saw more than that. He saw the grandson of a great man, almost one of the founders of the country. Rich, prominent, important, ambitious, logical, brilliant.
Let me say this too, that I want to acknowledge your skill as a researcher, because you found this one little fact that was only available in the first edition. And so it's one of those golden nuggets that I just referred to. And you've turned it into a wonderful story. And I want to let the audience know is that I asked if I could have a copy of this in advance, and I was not able to get one. So I haven't read it, but I can't wait. So do you think this Virginia planter was a real person? I know the book that the most recent book that I read, by David Donald, he makes no mention of it.
David Donald excludes it, which is otherwise the dean, the gold standard for Lincoln biographers. A fellow named Richard Brookhiser, who's a very prominent and careful researcher, believes it to be a fantasy. In fact, he believes it not to be his mother's fantasy, but Abraham Lincoln's fantasy. But that's even interesting that he would fantasize himself a revolutionary grandfather of importance. To the public, I should not dwell on it, but Lincoln kept this to himself. To the public, he was not candid. His biographer, and I'm talking about a campaign biographer. If you were an educated person, a literate person in 1860, and you wanted to know about the candidates who were running for president in 1860, the first time that Lincoln was on any ticket, he was a Republican nominee for president, you could find something called The Life of Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't really a book. This is a book, but this illustrates that it was run in newspapers.
Yeah.
So that newspapers all throughout the country ran this authorized campaign biography in which Lincoln had cooperated, and it was intended to be the life of Abraham Lincoln. If you said, gee, I wonder who his ancestors were, here's what you would have.
What does he say in his campaign biography?
Here's what you would read. Abraham Lincoln was born in Hardin County, Kentucky, February 12, 1809. It would be difficult to conceive of more unpromising circumstances than those under which he was ushered into life. His parents were poor and uneducated. Pretty much what you hear.
That's it, in terms of his...
Nothing about the Virginia planter.
Yeah.
Nothing about aristocratic ancestry. Virginia has this famous thing about first families of Virginia, people that go back to the beginning of the settlement and own the biggest lands. Washington, Jefferson, Lee, these people, and including, question mark the name, but the Virginia planter, who was the actual grandfather of Abraham Lincoln.
So does he ever come close to mentioning anything about this Virginia planter? And maybe in his earlier speeches, before he felt he maybe had to censor it?
Let me go back to the Herndon Informants. This is a book that was recently gathered from the materials that Herndon gathered, including letters, interviews, anything that he did in order to publish his famous book, Herndon's Lincoln. He didn't rely only on his own information. He looked for informants and witnesses. And one of the people he contacted was the author or journalist who met with Lincoln to write this campaign biography. That man was John Scripps. John Scripps wrote back to Mr. Herndon and said, he's talking about the interviews that he, more than one day, interviews that he gave, that he had with Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln communicated some facts to me concerning his ancestry, which he did not wish to have published, and which I have never spoken of or alluded to before. Answer your question. Yes, he talked with people who had to know about his ancestry, that he felt he had to tell them the truth. But he also told them, don't tell anybody.
Don't tell anyone.
And this is not only him, this is also to Herndon. When Herndon first heard this, let's get this out right now.
Yeah.
This is another book called Herndon on Lincoln, when he wrote letters to people about Lincoln other than his own book. And here's what he said about that. Lincoln and I had a case. Remember, they were trying cases together. They were both lawyers, right?
Yes.
Lincoln and I had a case in Menard Circuit Court which required a discussion on hereditary qualities of mind, nature, and Lincoln's mind was dwelling on his case. Lincoln all at once said, "Billy, I'll tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live." I'll repeat that. "Billy, I'll tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live."
Wow.
My mother was a bastard. She was the daughter of a nobleman, so-called, of Virginia. My mother's mother was poor and credulous, and she was shamefully taken advantage of by the man. My mother inherited his qualities, and I, hers. All that I am or hope ever to be, I get from my mother. God bless her. That's from Billy Herndon, the law partner, getting the information but keeping it close and not revealing it until the first edition.
But it's a very revealing statement.
Sure.
And are there any other instances that maybe you recall in the book, or just in general, perhaps that are testimony to or a testament to something he might have inherited from this grandfather that he didn't know?
Let's go about it in terms of Lincoln's very friendly cousin named John Hanks, who came in from Kentucky, not Dennis Hanks, another cousin. John Hanks came in to be with the family for a year or so. When he lived with them, which is including his mother was still alive, Abraham Lincoln's mother, when he lived with them, he noticed that she was very smart. I'm going to tell you, the people who remember Nancy Hanks, she died so long, even before the Civil War, that nobody was going out beating the bushes and trying to find information. The surviving witnesses included such people as John Hanks. Now, he said of Nancy, she had a clear intellectual mind, beyond all doubt an intellectual woman, rather extraordinary, if anything. Dennis Hanks described Nancy as keen, shrewd, smart, and I do say highly intellectual by nature. William Wood, who was a neighbor of theirs in the Indiana years, in fact, he sat up with Nancy during her final illness, said she was very smart, intelligent, and intellectual. Nat Grigsby, who was his brother married Lincoln's sister. Lincoln's sister died young, so a lot of people don't remember. Sally. There you go. So this is an intimate of the family. Nate Grigsby described Nancy as a lady of intelligence and praised her extraordinary strength of mind and called her brilliant. Now, if you're growing up with a woman, a mother, who is imaginative and brilliant and able to speak about the Bible and read and tell you stories about the Bible, George Washington, the founding of the country, say, wow, that might give you a good start in life. and direct your path. One thing that was missing, and I was glad to find it, is very hard to find. I wanted to find somebody who, all these people are saying she's brilliant, she's smart, which I think implies, using the old proverb, average people talk about things and money, stuff like that, weather. Smarter people talk about people. That's mostly gossip, but they do talk about people, who's smart, who isn't, who did nice things, who did bad things. And then really, the brilliant people, the intellectuals, talk about ideas. Well, to me, that those people talking about Nancy Hanks Lincoln was an intellectual in the frontier means that she talked about ideas. She put whole sentences together. And she did, and she held her ground, and she had an opinion. This is unusual because women had no vote and had technically no role in the political life of the country. But she did. So you'd say, well, why? What was it that she talked about? What ideas were they? And none of these people help us with that.
No.
But I found one.
Oh, you did?
I did. And it's beautiful because it's a reliable witness signing an affidavit. He felt so strongly about it, he was willing to sign it as an affidavit, swearing that it was the truth. This is a man named Christopher Columbus Graham.
Oh, what a name.
Christopher Columbus Graham. In about 1800, literally, there was a big election going on between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And about 1800, he was in the woods gathering roots and herbs. He was one of these people who was essentially the CVS pharmacy of the day, because you didn't get your medications from the store. You got them from a guy who was an herbalist, and he put things together and ground them up. Roots, berries, natural things, natural healing elements. So and he also was a physician, somehow trained as a physician, as they trained themselves in those days. So he's a doctor, if you will, a professional, an herbalist, the person who got around, literally, because he's in the woods gathering, and he's also coming into the villages. He's selling, he's dealing with people, and healing people. And he's got a great reason to be perceptive and a good analyst of people. 1800, he comes through the woods and sees something unusual for 1800, which is two women talking with a man about politics, about current events. Well, he's going to stop in his tracks. I mean, this isn't just old wives' tale and superstition or something. Mm-hmm. The full moon tonight is a good time to plant corn. This is people talking. And he remembered and he recorded what he heard. These are the topics that Nancy Hanks Lincoln was one of the women. He said that he heard them saying this stuff. I should, to make it clear what this is, Jesse Head in that part of Kentucky was a prominent abolitionist. He was against slavery. He was a Baptist preacher. He went around and evangelized not only the gospel, but also that slavery was wrong. Right? That's Jesse Head.
Oh, and he was a reverend, right?
He was a reverend.
Yes.
And asked me which minister conducted the ceremony of the wedding of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Head. Who?
Was it him?
It was.
Oh, my goodness.
Good. Okay, so he's coming through the woods and he's hearing these people in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And I'll quote from his affidavit. This is in my book because it's not easy to get, but you can also find it online. Christopher Columbus Graham.
So what does he say?
He's listening. And they reveal themselves, he said, as just steeped full of Jesse Head's notions about the wrong of slavery and the rights of man, as explained by Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. The revolutionaries, of course, Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Paine, who wrote, indeed, a book called The Rights of Man. But when you parse that out and say, okay, Slavery, wrong. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, rights of man. That's what Nancy Hanks, at about the age of 18, by the way, teenager, late teenager, is talking about when Christopher Columbus Graham comes by. If she's talking about these things when she's 18, I imagine that's why they're talking, she's an intellectual, over and over. She was bright, she was brilliant. Well, she was talking about these same things, wrong of slavery, Thomas Jefferson, when she was in the cabin with the kids. And she was bringing up Sally and Abraham to be good citizens. And she told them about the American Revolution. And what she told them about was that there was a cause for which men fought and died under George Washington. And that was before the Constitution, and before the Constitution which protects slavery as an institution. When they fought the Revolution, they had an idea that all men were created equal. Now that's it's radical, but it goes back. It's an original idea that had not, a promise, if you will, that had not yet been fulfilled. Now ask me if Abraham Lincoln made a similar speech ever.
Did he?
I'd like to tell you he did.
I bet you're going to tell us.
I'm gonna quote it to you.
Okay.
It's Abraham Lincoln was already president. He was elected. He was going to be sworn in. You may remember that from Springfield, Illinois, he made a long train trip
journey, yes,
to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
In February and early March of 1861. Southern states were already seceding. He was in trouble. The country was all in an uproar. And he was stops along the way, including Trenton, New Jersey. He stopped and spoke in Trenton, New Jersey, to the New Jersey legislators. And of course, if you're in the legislative crowd, I can envision it, that you're all ears and you're waiting and you're hoping for him to make an announcement and a statement about his policies and what he's going to do about the South and the secession. What do you call breaking news? You're waiting for that. And what does he say? What does he actually say in Trenton, New Jersey? Does anybody know? I'm going to quote from his speech.
Tell us.
By the way, these books there's an 8-volume series called The Collected Works of Abraham Lincoln. If you ever wanted to study his speeches, addresses, his letters, I guess almost laundry receipts. There's one for his missing horse. He's an advertisement. His horse was missing. Things like that. This is the book. They're all in there. What happened in the 1940s and 50s in Springfield, Illinois, is that some people got together as a civic project. And they said, what can we do to advance Lincoln studies with what little we have, little funding that we have and volunteers that we have? They said, maybe we could put together a book of all the letters and speeches and newspaper articles about debates which quote Lincoln. And maybe we could put together a book that would be useful for people, that they can follow Lincoln's trail from the very first thing he ever touched pen to paper and wrote, which they did find and put together, all the way through his life till the very last speech he made on the balcony of the White House, I think the day before he was killed. That's in here. There's an 8-volume thing. I think it's online used. You can get it it is now a couple $100. One time you could get it for like $20, but it was published in the 1950s. It's in all the libraries. So it's accessible. It's wonderful. Anyhow, this is in Trenton, New Jersey, the little speech he said to people apprehensive about the country's future, and this is what he said. May I be pardoned if, upon this occasion, I mentioned that away back in my childhood, the earliest days of my being able to read, I got hold of a small book, which was Weems' Life of Washington, which his mother had read to him before he could read. I remember all the accounts there given of the battlefields and the struggles, including the struggle here at Trenton, New Jersey, the crossing of the river, the contest with the Hessians, the great hardships endured at that time, all fixed themselves on my memory more than any single revolutionary event. And you all know, for you all have been boys, remember the legislature's all men, how those early impressions last longer than any others. And then remember what we just went through with Christopher Columbus Graham. The slavery is wrong, rights of man, equality of Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. Here we go. I am exceedingly anxious that that thing for which they struggled, that something even more than national independence, that something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world to all time to come, I am exceedingly anxious that this Union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which the struggle was made.
That's a wonderful anecdote, if you don't mind me saying so, because as you say, here he's on his way to Washington, and he stops in Trenton, and so he had this ability to say something simple, but he addressed it to his audience. In Trenton, he mentions the struggles of Trenton in the Revolutionary War, and yet he ties it into the principles that they were fighting for.
Indeed. Brilliant, intellectual,
and
comes
so
to mind and thinking of his mother.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's sort of proof that, in a way, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but in a way that this is what he got from his mother. That is, he believed in these things because his mother did.
Well, if you take a look at, remember there's 8 volumes, you don't have to go through them all, but in his first speech, that he moved from New Salem, a little village. He moved from New Salem to Springfield, Illinois in 1838, and he decided the best thing he could do was introduce himself in a public speech to the group that was called the Lyceum. So he made a speech to the Springfield Lyceum, and in that speech he introduced himself this way. This is 1838, far before 1861, and yet you'll detect something, the element of the revolution in what he's saying. He's talking about the revolution, and he says, at the close of that struggle, nearly every adult male had been a participator in some of its scenes. By that he means the battles. The consequence was that of those scenes, in the form of a husband, a father, a son, or a brother, a living history was to be found in every family, a history bearing the indisputable testimonies of its own authenticity. If you raised your hand and said, Mr. Lincoln, you said every family has a father or some relative who was in the American Revolution.
And who's he going to answer?
I think so. My mother said it was her father, but we're not quite clear what his name was or who he served with, though she told me a lot about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. The reality behind the screen, he's not exactly bluffing. He's certainly expressing sincerely his sense that he's related to one of the founders of the country, one of the fighting founders of the country, in this Virginia planter. Remember, Raymond, you can tell me, the first 6 presidents of the United States, not counting John Adams, we know he wasn't
They're all Virginia planters.
They're all Virginia planters. When Abraham Lincoln was born, I think until he was 5 or 6 years old, he was looking around and saying, you know, Virginia planter equals president.
Yeah.
Or the reverse, president equals Virginia planter. the group that was selected was always a Virginia planter. I've got to say that he had a running head start, real good beginning in his life to be feeling that he was the grandson of a Virginia planter. He was the grandson of those people who become presidents of the United States. He was an American prince. Again, that's my title. I believe in it. I also said, now this is a little subtitle to the book, which matters because we've been talking about it. Abraham Lincoln, American Prince, Ancestry, Ambition, and the Anti-Slavery Cause. You can see that mixed in, and importantly for historical purposes, mixed in there is the sense that Abraham Lincoln was born and brought up to be anti-slavery, because Thomas Jefferson was. Even though Thomas Jefferson had slaves, Thomas Jefferson expressed the promise, the cause for which those men fought beyond national independence that he was talking about, alluding to in Trenton, New Jersey, on his way to the White House.
And so, can we tie this back to your Zebedee story in the sense that, so the father who was or perhaps wasn't, and so he believed his grandfather held slaves, but at the same time he was anti-slavery. And do you have are there any more instances of a couple of stories that maybe some of his contemporaries, he told to his contemporaries, let's say?
Well, let's put it this way.
You mentioned one to me, that happened in 1851, I know.
Let's put it this way. When Lincoln credited his grandfather, remember where I read that part from Billy Herndon's book, he told his law partner, he credited his ambition and his logic to his grandfather. When he got data, when he received information about Virginia, when he read and went over carefully the statistics from the United States Census, and he did. He looked over the 1850 census, and he saw how many they called in those days mixed race children, or grow up to be adults, mixed race people. They called them mulattoes. White and black mixed together were mulattoes. And they were listed in the census in a different column than the whites or the blacks. He looked up and found that in New Hampshire there were like 400, and in Virginia there were like 70,000.
Yes, wow.
And he brought that up. He brought that to public attention when he was on the platform debating Stephen Douglas. He said to the folks, did you look at the census? And did you find that there was quite a substantial, there were more mulattoes in Virginia than there were in any other, you take all the other states together. So who was the father, this thing, who was the father of Zebedee's children? Well, there were these Zebedee's children who were colored, as they said it. And the fathers were not acknowledging their paternity. So when you asked who was the father of those children, Abraham Lincoln was a white man who had more uncertainty than most people about whether he had black cousins or aunts and uncles when he was growing up. And he had such a natural disposition, feeling, heart, sentiment, empathy, that he could not imagine tolerating and not trying his part to change things favorably, really, for people in his own family.
How are we doing for time? Because I did want to ask you a question about, do you think there's any, so let's say, background to the fact that Lincoln, with his family, left Kentucky, where slavery was allowed, and into Indiana and Illinois, where it was not allowed, after the ordinance of 1788, I believe. So, do you think that was this anti-slavery stance even then was part directly influencing his life?
That's a fantastic question because it does relate to his mother and his relationship with his mother, and I'd like to explain it. It'll take me a little longer than most of my answers because it's a two-parter.
Okay.
First, if you go to the archive, lots of books publish the little biography that autobiographical sketch that Abraham Lincoln put together to help his biographer in 1860. They publish it. And it says that they moved from Kentucky, slave territory, to free soil, Indiana, mainly because of his father's land title disputes, but partly because of slavery, partly on account of slavery. What you don't get from the published accounts is visible in the original document, handwritten, that was preserved, and is in the National Archives. And I have seen online, because you can get it online and look at it. And I've studied. He originally wrote, they moved from Kentucky to Indiana on account of his father's land title disputes. After he had written more, he went back, obviously a second reading, and he said, oh, that's not quite right. And he inserted, and in between lines scribbled, and partly on account of slavery. So what your question was when Lincoln thought back intently, and not just sketching quickly about his father having to get out of Kentucky for land title issues. But there was something else. Oh, it was also partly on account of slavery. He wrote this in his own hand, writing, inserted. They moved when he was 7 years old. It was not Abraham Lincoln, age 15, speaking at the family table and insisting that they should go to free soil. It wasn't his voice. Between his father and his mother, we already know who kept talking about the rights of man and slavery is wrong, and who presumably engineered that Jesse Head would officiate at the wedding.
At the wedding.
His mother, who was brilliant, who was intellectual, wasn't Tom Lincoln, his mother. So when he inserted that phrase, partly on account of slavery, that they moved from the slave state to the free soil, the answer is yes, emphatically. Who explains things to the kids? Who tells the kids what's what? The mothers. In fact, go back to the 1838 speech just for a second.
Okay.
When Lincoln talks about the instructors of young people, instructors of infants, really. It's quick. This is the first public speech he made. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap.
Oh, that's wonderful.
He's talking about, it's not the fathers that teach us, it's the mothers.
It's the mothers.
So the mothers, even from our earliest age. So when he was 7, my suggestion is, his mother took Sally and Abraham and gave them the sad news. He said, we're going to have to move. Your friends, you're never going to see again. Those schools that you started, I'm sorry, that's over. Everything familiar to you in civilized, if you will, Kentucky is over for you. We're going to go across the broad Ohio River. And when we get over there, it's just a tangle of brushwood and panthers and animals, bears. We're going to be scraping. We're going to be living in a lean-to for 6 months, and we're going to build eventually a cabin. And as far as neighbors, we're going to have a neighbor a mile or two away. There's not going to be anybody next door. There's not going to be people all around. And we're going to be making cornfields where there was once just woods. We're going to first settlers. Why are we doing that, Mama? Or else she comes out with it spontaneously and says, we're part of, remember that cause greater than national independence that she was speaking about in her teenage years? We're part of the people sacrificing to make this country free, to free people who are in bondage. We're part of that movement by moving as we are. So then Lincoln thought about those things, whatever the words were that his mother said, because he's only 7.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in fairness, he ought to put in his autobiography, even the little sketch, there's only a few pages, he inserted, partly on account of slavery, because of his mother's words, is my belief. That's what I'm saying to you.
Yeah, and you know, it's really, geographically even, I thought about this in your previous presentation at the Sawyer Free Library, that it's really interesting that many of the Virginia planters, and also from North Carolina, they often came across the Alleghenies, often using the Cumberland Gap, and they brought with them, you know, at least a familiarity of the slavery plantations. But then those who go north of the Ohio River, no slavers. No slaves. And I'm so glad you're pointing at that book, because, and I'll let the folks at home know, I've been staring at that brilliant cover, which looks like it has a Roman laurel on it, and I was going to say, what do you have to tell us from that book?
All right. This is going to be the last thing I mention.
Okay.
Dennis Hanks, because the last interview of Dennis Hanks. Dennis Hanks, 90 years old, was interviewed by a female reporter from Chicago. And when he was 90, he got more information on the books than earlier. And he says, again, she tried to imitate his dialect, and I will too. She tried to imitate his dialect in the writing she made. I reckon it was thinking on Nancy and things she'd done said to him that started Abe to studying. Nancy kept urging Abe to study. Abe, she'd say, learn all you can, be of some account. And she'd tell him stories about George Washington and say that Abe had just as good Virginia blood in him as Washington.
Yes.
Maybe she stretched things, but it done Abe good. Well, I think that's about the last word on the subject.
Excellent.
Gloucester Bookies is about concluded for this episode. We thank you for listening. Thank everybody for the attention they've given, and I hope you give attention to Nancy Hanks Lincoln in the future. Brilliant, intellectual woman, strong-willed, anti-slavery, and of course, we benefit to this day from the way she raised her kids.
Well, thank you, Wayne, for sharing this book with us, but also for the research that you did. And I can't wait to read the book, to be honest.
Thank you.